Okay, well, several weeks ago, I had considered skipping over Genesis chapter 17 because I'm wanting to progress forward and I don't want to cover any material that is redundant. And in this chapter, you do get uh, some passages that you'll feel like we have read this before. It's a reminder that we are going over a book that is comprised of multiple sources, and those multiple sources sometimes tell the same story twice, but in a different way. I decided to go ahead and go over Genesis chapter 17 for a few reasons. The first reason is I think we can learn in the subtle differences, even in the repetitive material. What's different about it? What is the source, and how does what we know about that source help us better understand the differences? And then the second reason was this has the passage where Abram's name is changed to Abraham, which is a very memorable part of the Bible. Just those few verses are taught in Sunday school about this name change and the significance of a name change. But the third reason is this is the passage where the second sign of the covenant that God has made with the people is spoken of, and that sign is circumcision, which today in modern times may feel like a very strange rite and ritual for God to prescribe. What's described here as it's carried out is graphic and maybe even disturbing to some people. And I especially thought this as I was looking up art for this. So just give you some forewarning. Some of the art I found through the Renaissance and even back into the Middle Ages of this Abraham having all of the men in his family circumcised, and even the servants and the children. It's it's graphic and odd, I think. But I think the important point as we move forward, the important thing to see is that it's what the ritual symbolizes that is important. It's what's beneath it that's important to the people and their understanding. And we too have our rituals that, if you really think about them, are kind of nonsensical in some ways. For example, I might think of baptism. Why are we dunking one another in water in front of everybody else? Well, once you explain the deep meaning behind it, it carries on more significance. And so I decided that it would be best to go through Genesis chapter 17 and to talk about it. And so we will begin at verse 1, which goes, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, 'I am God Almighty.'" In the Hebrew, that's El Shaddai. We'll talk more about that in a second. "I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you. And we will make you exceedingly numerous." Then Abram fell on his face, and God, Elohim, notice that difference, said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations." The difference in using Elohim being, this is not Yahweh. This is not Yahweh's material. This is priestly material, which uses Elohim. If Genesis is starting to get repetitive, as I was saying earlier, you're not alone in noticing this. You may be thinking, wait, didn't God already make a covenant with Abram? And as we've been saying all along, many different sources comprise the Torah, and these sources include many different accounts of the same events, but with some differences. Today's reading is the priestly account of God's making a covenant with Abram. We read the Yahweh's account in chapter 15. That was the one where he was told to look at the stars and that his ancestors would be as numerous as the stars. That was the Yahweh's account. This is the priestly account. El Shaddai means God of the mountain. So God ascribes this new name to God's self, and in so doing is linguistically tying God to the one who speaks to Moses on the mountain, but more importantly to the priestly scribe. This is also meant to linguistically tie this God to the temple worship on the mount in Jerusalem. The priestly sources for the Torah have right and proper worship as a high priority. They are wanting you to do the rituals in the right way, and that's why there's a lot of descriptions in the priestly sources of the right ways to do the rituals, as we will read here in a little bit. But then also they believe that real worship happens at the temple in Jerusalem. That is where right and proper worship is meant to be happening. And so this God of the mountain is an important name for the priestly source. And also, I'd like to say something about this word blameless. Sounds like a unfair burden to put on somebody. Be blameless, as if anyone could. But this word actually in the Hebrew means more like complete, whole, or entire, or sound. And God is not commanding Abram to become a perfect person, but is rather promising health and wholeness to Abram. This is something that God will do for Abram, bring him to a place of completeness, wholeness, and soundness. And Abram, in response, falls before God, indicating that he is willing to walk before or with God on this ongoing journey or odyssey. Verse 5, no longer shall your name be Abram, which means exalted ancestor, but your name shall be Abraham, ancestor of a multitude. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, God changes Abram's name to Abraham, a dialectical variation of the name Abram, but here understood to carry a different meaning, father of a multitude. A name change does not refer to a change in personality or character, but marks a new stage in his identification with the divine purpose. He must now live up to his new name, which focuses not on his personal relationship with God, but on his relationship to the nations. The name looks outward, centered on the lives of others. Abraham's election involves mission. So keep in mind, the priestly scribes who wrote this version were well aware of other nations. Abraham is to be the father of a multitude of nations, meaning that on a fundamental level, even persons of other nations may well be Israel's kin. This name change signifies a more inclusive future for the people of Israel. So instead of a name that just exalts the patriarch, this is a name that says that this will be the father of a multitude of various diverse nations. And so it's a more outward looking name, a more inclusive and welcoming name. Assumes that there will be other peoples that they will walk alongside. It goes on, I will make you exceedingly fruitful and will make nations of you. The kings and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien. And I emphasize that. Abraham is still an alien in this land. All the land of Canaan for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. So there's not much to say here that hasn't already been said during other lessons where we considered passages where God makes promises and covenants with Abram / now Abraham. Although it has been noted that here the focus is less on land and heavy on offspring. You may remember back in chapter 15 and in chapter 12, it was more or less a balance, land and offspring spoken back and forth. And here it really has a narrow focus on offspring and future generations and future nations. And even Abraham's name change seems to point us in this direction. In fact, Abraham not yet possessing the land is emphasized in verse 8 when it is referred to as the land where you are now an alien. Fritham writes, the promise was for the future. It would not be fully realized in his lifetime, as we read in chapter 23. This would have even an especially important word for landless. This would be an especially important word for landless exiles. So, of course, this makes sense when one considers the time that the priestly sources were being written, around 538 BCE, during the Persian occupation and exile. The people are still waiting to possess the land. Even then, this would be, centuries and centuries and centuries after when these stories were said to have happened. So they're still waiting, just as their ancestors, even Abraham, had done. And here's a brief reminder of when these things were compiled. So if you were in the time of the Yahwist source, the 900s and 800s BCE, you may well expect to possess the land. In fact, that was basically the situation before the exile, that various tribes of Israelites occupied the land. But by the time you get to the priestly source, which is around 538 BCE, the diaspora or the scattering of the Jewish people had already happened. And so it makes sense that this version put together around that time would have been less keen on emphasizing the promise for land, because that probably seemed a promise that was a world away. However, evidence of other nations that perhaps are their own kin, that was very real to them, because they were, even scattered, they could see that they had been fruitful and had multiplied, even in the context of diaspora. So here we get to the fun stuff. Verse 9, God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." So very violent, painful ritual, and very dire consequences if it is not kept. What is going on? Well, Green writes in my Common English Bible commentary, circumcision is the symbol of the covenant with Abraham, just as the rainbow is the symbol of the covenant with Noah and the whole world. In fact, that rainbow portion of the Noah and the Ark account is from the priestly source as well. And so we are to think of this symbol of this sign of the covenant as a same sort of thing. We are to think of this sign of the covenant as the same sort of binding promise, or evidence of the same kind of binding promise. He goes on to write, "The origin and meaning of the ritual of circumcision are difficult to determine. It was practiced in many ancient Near Eastern cultures, though not among the Philistines. Here, circumcision is nevertheless viewed as the required ritual of entrance into the community of Israel. It illustrates the male-centered character of Israelite society and religion. The biblical household or family included not only Abraham's own children, but also his servants, those purchased with their silver." A custom already common in the area is here ascribed deep significance, much like baptism would for Christians centuries later. One notices that women are included in the covenant, but not prescribed a similar requirement, which I am sure they were very grateful. The circumcision was to be carried out on the 8th day, and the reason for that is, on one hand, nice, but on another hand, kind of cringeworthy. That's so that the mother could be present. Very nice. Because she was deemed unclean for 7 days after the birth. Well, that is too bad. But remember, this is from the priestly source, and the priestly source has rule keeping and right proper ritual ever in mind. So, of course, it's going to be on the 8th day so that the mother can be present for this ritual. By the way, the pictures that I found on the internet when I just typed in Genesis chapter 17, which you're looking at one right now, were just hilarious. But anyway, I digress. This sign of the covenant is meant to be delicate, made manifest. I don't know what exactly word to look for, on the most intimate of body parts for a man. He is reminded every time he uses it. Okay, forget attempts at being delicate. He is reminded every time he urinates or attempts to procreate that he is bound to God by way of God's promise, that this member is the instrument by which God's promise will, in part, be fulfilled. The reminder that he is meant to walk in wholeness with God is ever unavoidable. For a Jew not to take on this sign is to reject the promise of God. It is to signify that one has no interest in walking in faithfulness to God. Now, that seems a bit unfair because, of course, it's the children. In this story, Abraham is circumcised at the age of 99, Ishmael at 13. Ouch. But it's the babies going forward that will be. So how in the world could a baby reject the covenant of God, right? Well, neglecting circumcision does not constitute the essence of breaking the covenant. This is Fratham in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. Such neglect signifies unfaithfulness, a mark of an already broken relationship. In other words, one is to be cut off from the people, not because the circumcision is important in and of itself. What matters is what it signifies, what the symbolism of the ritual means. Also, God is referring not so much to individuals who may or may not be circumcised, but to the entire people. One has difficulty imagining that uncircumcised children would have, quote unquote, broken the covenant. Right, but rather this text refers to the community in which circumcision functions as a sign. The author may have in mind a situation where Israel collectively has become lax, perhaps during a time like the exile. And so I think we're better to think of the community foregoing this ritual rather than to focus on specific individuals, especially when we're talking about children, because, how do they break a covenant with God? It seems a bit absurd to even suggest that they could. All this to say, the physical act of circumcision did not matter as much to Israel as what the religious rite symbolized and meant. This would become clearer through the centuries as the prophets would begin to refer to circumcision of the heart, a phrase that Paul did not coin. This actually comes from the prophets, and I have an example from it right here in Jeremiah. It's a very awkward concept unless taken very metaphorically. Jeremiah 4 verse 4 reads, "Circumcise yourselves to the Lord, remove the foreskin of your hearts, O people of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, or else my wrath will go forth like fire and burn with no one to quench it because of the evil of your doings." That could be a poetic way of saying cut off from your people. And it's where how the heart's posture is towards God that seems to matter, and the circumcision is just a sign, a symbol, a reminder of that. Then the scene shifts a bit away from prescriptions for circumcision, and almost the same thing that we read earlier as it relates to Abram turning to Abraham, but now it's Sarai who gets the name change. Verse 15, God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." Now, Sarai and Sarah both mean the same thing, princess. Sarah is less archaic than Sarai, and so this is like an updating of an old word for a new word that means the same thing. So maybe a modern equivalent would be, updating from an old English word into one that's more commonly used. So this is more of an update, but in this text, this renaming functions as a way of including Sarah in the covenant. Here she is assured for the first time that she will be the mother of the multitudes of nations. She is named as the one who, quote, shall give rise to nations. So apparently her attempts to sire children by way of her slave Hagar were unnecessary, although one could hardly blame her, all things considered, from the information that she had been given up to that point. She had as of yet not been given a direct indication that she would be the mother of nations and kings. Rytham writes, the text does not subsume her under Abraham, finding her importance for the future only through him. She participates genuinely in the covenant. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." So Abraham cannot believe what he is hearing. So he takes on the mindset we found back in chapter 16 when he fathered a child by way of his slave Hagar. In fact, Abraham still seems to think that this is the way forward. Now, next week, when we're going to be reading a Yahweh source, one of the J sources, telling a similar story, it's Sarah who laughs, and that's the one that we most remember. In fact, when I was trying to find a picture of Abraham laughing at this announcement, I found dozens and dozens of pictures of Sarah laughing from next chapter, even though I would very distinctly type in Genesis 17, Abraham laughing. It's like that's the one that we remember is the one where Sarah laughs incredulously. But here it's Abraham in this source. Moving on. God said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year." And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham, presumably went up to the mountain where El Shaddai is from. So Isaac means he laughs. And this is really a great play on words. It's as if God is winking at humanity and saying, go ahead, you can laugh when I promise the seeming impossible, and I'll sit back and watch what in fact happens next. The promise made to Hagar and Ishmael in chapter 16 is repeated, but this time on behalf of Abraham. In fact, Abraham wills that his son Ishmael be a part of the blessing going forward, though not in the covenant God makes with Abraham's offspring by way of Isaac and Jacob, who is later named Israel. Now, a little warning, the next picture is probably the most controversial. When I showed this to Kelly, she couldn't believe that I was going to include it in the presentation, but I don't know. It's a work of art from the 1300s, so this is like, medieval times, and it's portraying the event here described what we're about to read. So there you have it. I know. And this is painted on a wall somewhere. This is painted on a wall somewhere in Paris. Sorry if it offends. So the text reads, "Then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all the slaves born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, slaves born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him." So at this point, we're really just cleaning up. The function of these verses seems to be to assure the reader that Abraham was good to keep the command. His commitment is shown by his willingness to submit to circumcision at the ripe old age of 99. And I don't know if he did so himself, as this picture would depict with what looks to me like a butter knife. I'm sorry. Also, Ishmael was put to the knife at 13. Basically, I pretty much feel sorry for all the participating parties. Ouch. So what are the takeaways? And I know we're laughing at this, but what are the takeaways? First, to get back into a more of a sober mindset here, I think that one thing to continually bear in mind whilst considering texts from the priestly source is that they are texts penned in exile. It's no wonder that the focus seems to be less on land, the land that is promised, as with the J source, that was written before the exile, and has more to do with progeny. The Israelites could be fruitful and multiply even in exile, and what's more, this passage's emphasis on multitudes of nations leaves the Israelites in exile room to view the foreign persons they interact with as potential kin. So it opens them up to new possibilities as it relates to how they will live in community with other types of people. Next, Sarah is finally included in the covenant in an overt way. She now knows that she is a part of it, and she should take solace in this. While she or her daughters were not required to cut or mark their body as a sign of the covenant, as was Abraham, she will be held as the mother of nations going forward. And lastly, circumcision, whilst a strange custom, should in this context be viewed as a symbol and sign of something far deeper. It is meant to be a reminder as is Noah's rainbow, that God is faithful and keeps God's promises. And as I said, both the rainbow story, where there's a sign of a covenant made, and this story come from the priestly source. So rites and rituals still today point us towards deep truths. Christians experience the transcendent by way of Holy Communion and baptism. And these acts, in and of themselves, are not the point, but what rather lies just beneath them is the point. Baptismal water does not save us, but the experience alludes to God's grace that calls us from the depths of death's shadow and onto life. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I encourage you to take this story in its context and in its time. And I should also say that circumcision, I think this was noted on briefly, but circumcision was not a custom that was made up by the Israelites. The Egyptians did it. There were other peoples in the area that would also have done this. So this was an adaptation of a pre-existing custom that we really don't know where it came from, and ascribed to it specific meaning, which is the way that it works. You take something that is already quite common, like in the time of Jesus and John the Baptist. Baptism was not something that Jesus invented or Christians invented. It was something that different Jewish sects were already doing. And over the time, Christians took this pre-existing custom and gave it new meaning. And so here, as graphic as it may be, we have an example of that. And the important thing is what it meant to the people, what it meant to them. So you have to try to have, put on a sociological lens and try to see it from their point of view. So that's chapter 17. How many of you were familiar with those stories?
Yeah.
Yep.
I was more familiar with the stuff that doesn't seem as important or to the point. I was more familiar with the renaming of Abraham, and I was expecting some profound meaning behind that. And there was some meaning, right? Father of nations as opposed to exalted father. It's a more outward looking name. And then when I got to Sarah's new name, I was expecting it to be some revelation, and really it was just an updating from an older version to a newer version. So I was kind of surprised at that. I toyed with the idea of skipping over the passage and the parts about circumcision, not to be delicate, but just because I wasn't quite sure as to its relevance. But then I was reminded through my reading that this is still not only a core foundational story for the Jewish people, but this is still something that they practice and in the same way. And so I think it would be best for us to talk about it, to have better understanding of our Jewish brothers and sisters and how they see circumcision as not a medical procedure, but as a sign of the covenant that God is still going to keep with them. So,
I believe there's a scripture that says all of the Bible is useful for knowledge, to gain knowledge. I can't remember how it goes.
I think I know what you're talking about.
It's what?
Yeah, I have a comment.
I thought it was instruction. Suitable.
Instruction, useful for instruction. Even when you get to, is it Leviticus with all, Numbers with all the names are. I can't quite get that one, but anyway, it's good.
Well,
Someone
BK,
said they had
say
a question.
something?
Was that Nancy?
I think it's BK. Okay.
I said I had a comment. I don't know if you're hearing me or not. BK.
I am.
Oh, good. Okay. I think a lot of times the word name in the scripture refers to nature, the nature of. And what's being done here is there is a change in the nature of the person. And I'm reading that specifically as from just feeling you are human to realizing that you are also inwardly spiritual.
Sometimes names,
in the nature of, in the name of, in the nature of, in the name of God, in the nature of God.
Well, we'll be talking about what it means to be, in part, made in God's image on Sunday in the sermon that I wrote it this morning. In in this verse, I think the renaming functions to broaden Abraham's understanding of the scope of what is being done by way of his offspring. Language of not just be a blessing to all nations, but you will be a father of all nations, and that signified in the name. And Sarai's renaming does redefine also her relationship as it relates to the divine, because before this, and we talked about this in earlier lessons, BK, that you may have caught up on through the video, or maybe not, but the before this, the text is ambiguous as to whether or not Sarai is going to be the mother of Abraham's offspring, which is why she has anxiety about it and has a surrogate mother, her servant Hagar, brought in. And this text makes it clear to the reader that no, it is, make no mistake about it, it's Sarah. Although I do appreciate how it's Abraham who advocates for his son Ishmael to be included in some way in this promise, and that God reiterates what has already been said to Hagar in last week's passage. I appreciate that, because you understand why Hagar would advocate for her son in a future for her son, but it's unclear. At times it seems unclear what Abraham thinks of Ishmael. I mean, he's willing to at times, late in chapters later, drive him into the desert at request of Sarah, which is obviously a terrible thing to do to your son. But there are several things that surprised me. I didn't really know what I was going to go into chapter 17 wanting to come out and talk to you about until I actually got into the work of it. Usually I come in it with an idea of what's going to come out.
Well, a couple of things occurred to me, and one was just getting back to the bloody scene. I wondered, like, how many people died of fulminating infections. I mean, that was just the thought.
Well,
but okay. So setting that aside, today in the Christian world, there's an automatic sort of assumption that baby boys, before they even leave the hospital, newborns are going to be circumcised. I mean, that's become less of it's more of a question now in parents' minds that this is an optional procedure. But there was a time that every single newborn male was circumcised before they left the hospital. And that procedure was completely divorced from, the Judeo-Christian tradition. There was no ritual attached to it. There was no significance religion-wise attached to it. It just somehow took on a life of its own, and for what purpose? And so, it's like, wow, we came to this place where it was just assumed that was going to happen and nobody thought why. And whereas in the Jewish tradition, the bris, I think it's called at 8 days, is still very unusual, and I'm told very beautiful ceremony where the community gathers around. And I've even been told that the baby doesn't even cry. I mean, somehow they create this environment where it's almost like a trance that's created, where I don't know if they give this child alcohol or I don't know what happens, but they somehow really invoke the presence of God, and something magical happens. But it's a very hallowed tradition and experience. So I'm told. Wow, we really got uncoupled there where circumcision is concerned.
There are reasons for that, and even in the Christian scriptures. So there was a big debate. You may have read in the book of Galatians, I think is where it's most poignant, where there was this debate about what are these Gentiles entering into these Jewish Jesus-following communities. There would be these Christian communities comprised of Jews. And Paul saw it as his mission to graft Gentiles onto this beautiful tree that he talks about in Romans, that is the human race. And the Gentiles are like a branch grafted onto this tree that God was already cultivating through these interactions with the Jewish people in their story. And there were some who believed that the Gentiles had to, very much in the fashion we just read in this passage, become circumcised, and this was becoming an impediment to, well, who wants to sign up for that? Right? So I'll pay some dues, but that seems a bit too much.
Isn't it Paul that has Timothy circumcised because he's Jewish, and to make it known that he is Jewish, even though his father's Greek, which is why he wasn't circumcised, that he is still Jewish because of his mother and grandmother, and he has him circumcised.
That's right. And Paul is not even quite happy about that, but the point about it is the covenant that God made with Abraham still carries for the Jewish people, but this is a different thing happening as it relates to the Gentile people. So Paul was very upset and said, Gentiles don't need, they don't have much to do really with that covenant made with Abraham, except for now they are entering into this divine plan towards redemption, but in a unique way. And so Christians really have never had a prescription to get circumcised. I think it's largely cultural in our time and day. I mean, when we were considering for Abel, it was health. I wanted to know what doctors thought. I wasn't entering into it at all from a religious mindset, because that is not a ritual that has the meanings and the depths and the layers that we've been discussing. For me, I wasn't raised in it. It wasn't cultivated in me, as symbolism really has to be. It has to be cultivated and created by a community for somebody to appreciate what it means to say, look at a cross and be moved, or any other symbol.
I have a question about 17, at least in the translation that I have. Abraham fell down face, he laughed, and then said to himself, will a son be born to a man who is 100 years old, yada, yada, so forth and so on. And then it says, then Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. I just wonder to himself that in the first place, God would have known what he said to himself, but I just thought that was unique.
So it's almost the way I read that, and sometimes with pronouns and translating Hebrew, and it's hard to, there might be some some disagreement as to the way it should be translated. My take on reading that is that it's almost like an aside, when you maybe, it's trying to help the reader understand that he's having this internal dialogue, or perhaps outer dialogue if he mutters it out loud, about just not being able to believe it. Like we all have those moments where we react to something and speak aloud our own doubts or concerns. Or
I'm going to go get my message and see what it says.
Okay.
Well, this is neither here nor there, but my grandson in California, I'm not sure why he wasn't circumcised at the hospital, but anyway, he wasn't. And so they had arranged for something, and they have a friend who's Jewish, and she gave them the contact information. And so this rabbi, whom I don't know if he was also a doctor or not, but he came to the house and performed the circumcision. And it's true, the baby didn't even cry. This guy is an expert.
Wow.
And so anyway, I don't think they told them that they weren't Jewish, but anyway. There was some kind of little ritual with it, but anyway, he did a wonderful job with it, because I think he does it all the time. Yeah.
I'm glad they have a way to do it so that it doesn't hurt the infant.
I've seen videos where it did hurt the baby, very visibly. So I'd imagine it may have to do with
cried.
may have to do with the moil, whoever's.
Yeah, I don't know.
But they don't remember it. But it's still not still painful. Who knows what that does? I don't know.
Oh, I don't think it's a good thing.
This translation says almost the same thing. I use the Message to put it in today's language, knowing that it may not be exactly what the other ones are, but I do find it gives in. Well, for one Sunday, you preached about something and you said, actually, that means black and blue. And I looked down, I happened to have the Message. I looked down, I said, yeah, that's what my version says, black and blue. So sometimes it's right.
Well,
Abraham fell flat on his face and then laughing, thinking, instead of to himself, thinking, can 100-year-old man father a son? Can Sarah at 90 have a baby? And then it says, recovering, Abraham said to God, oh, keep Ishmael alive and well before you. So it's more or less the same, but I still don't think I understand it.
I think it basically means they were older. They were considerably older, but I think they exaggerated on the age for sure.
We are, and another thing too, the art about Sarah and Abraham. They either do two things that I found, and I can't. It cracks me up both ways. On one, you might get like a very pregnant, very elderly woman that's supposed to be Sarah. Like she looks like, my grandma when I'd go visit her, but she's very, very visibly pregnant, and it's a very odd thing to be looking at. The other direction that it goes is they will take pictures where she has all of the appearance of youth and vitality, but very gray hair. So they're trying to resolve this sort of strange idea that a woman in her 90s would conceive a child. And that the incredulity you feel at that is on purpose, because you're remember, these are the promises God makes, and is God good on God's promises? And if you're reading this in exile, not having been given very many reasons to hope for your own liberation, you read this story where God could bring new life in a very unlikely circumstance. That's the point. So there's even symbolism in the old age. So those who are wanting to take it literally and wonder about it biologically are almost missing they are missing the point.
Exactly.
The point is, like, this is in it. Yeah. But the art, I thought there have been some of these stories where I thought I was going to find just all kinds of great illustrations, and then I find myself 15 minutes looking for a good picture for just one verse that I really want to get right. And the longer that I search for it, the more determined I am to find the sort of thing I'm looking for. I don't know.
I just want to say one thing that I feel badly about saying. I said I don't think it's a good thing. I'm not talking about circumcision. I'm saying I think presenting painful stimulus to a newborn is a bad thing. And in medicine, we used to think, oh, we'll just circumcise these infants and they don't feel it. And we actually have studies now that show that yes, they are experiencing pain, and it's a bad thing for them. So, we used to run in there and we had all these drapes and these things that we used to circumcise these infants, and we gave them nothing. And that was a horrible thing. So it's probably my own guilt. And so it's not a comment about circumcision. It's more a comment about how we treated these newborns. So
Thanks for clarifying, and I think I understood that from the onset. But
okay, yeah, I wanted to say it's not a value judgment on the procedure. It's more a value judgment on how we've treated little babies, and not, acknowledge that they feel pain. So that's
we don't remember it, but that has to have been a tremendous experience for us, and it. Who knows what went through our minds at the time if we were able to actually put thoughts together. But that had to be a tremendous thing to go through.
Yeah.
I like to say that in the same way, doctors used to think that we should all have our tonsils removed and our appendix removed. And I think that God created every single human part to have great value. And in those days, maybe they thought, no pain, no gain. They wanted to do that kind of stuff. But honestly, I do not believe God wants us to deface our body or mutilate our body for anything. That is my personal belief. That's why you're piercing your ears and your nose and stuff like that. So to put God, and this is the promise of God, that's why people do all this stuff. But I think that God is far more compassionate and really made a wonderful human body. It's just our interpretation. So as in, like when Jesus said, you got all this baptism or water. When I studied baptism, we believed that first there was water, and then there's the baptism of fire. And I always remember this nun telling us, we would say, what if you're dying in the desert and you want to be converted? Or what do you do? There's no water. And she said, look, there's also the baptism of desire. If you desire to be baptized, there's the Holy Spirit is there. You don't need the doggone water. We used to say, how about spit? If the pain is going down, you want to be baptized, should I put my spit on you? There's all the water that I have. So I'm just saying that maybe I'm really out, but I firmly believe that God made our bodies to be so whole and wonderful. Every part has a part to play in our health. And we as humans decide all this stuff that personally I think is irrelevant. Some of those rituals are barbaric, and to kind of color sugarcoat it. Same way the Muslims, you want to be a Muslim, you have to be circumcised. So you've got interfaith racial marriages. People are not Muslim, want to marry this Muslim girl, then they have to go get circumcised. And so sometimes they don't bother get married at all. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. Because I have participated and helped babies being circumcised when I was in nursing school at Methodist Hospital. They put this little ring thing around it, and the baby squealed, and then they said, "Oh, now with research, the baby feels the pain." It does. I mean, that is real pain. But anyhow, I'll shut up and let you know that I firmly believe that God wants us to take care of our bodies in every shape and form,
Well,
and God is not elevated by these rituals.
Well, again, it's about what the ritual means to. You can make an idol of a ritual. Disciples have done this at times with baptism. If we were considering the history of baptism in a class in seminary, we were talking about those that believed that if you were not baptized, then you would go to hell. And this comes from our restoration backgrounds as disciples. This was a lively debate on into the early 20th century, and I quipped sarcastically, how if you just prayed through and you're on your way down to the baptismal waters and you trip and hit your head on a rock and die? Like, what does that mean? It's what it means. You take baptism. It's not bloody. It's not a bloody ritual, obviously, but it is very earthy and humble, and doesn't really have to mean anything if you don't put on all of these layers of meaning that we have done through the centuries. And with circumcision, as it relates to the Jewish people and the Muslim people, that's what they've done. And I don't like babies being hurt, and I hope that they would do it in a painless way. But I guess this is a discussion we'll have to have in their communities. I'll end with this. I have had my tonsils and adenoid removed because before I had that done, I would get multiple sinus infections a year because they wouldn't allow my sinuses to drain properly. Mm-hmm. And so to care for my body, I needed to have them removed. Also my wisdom teeth, because I was getting mouth infections. And so there are times, and everyone's different, where it's not that I'm signing up for some form of mutilation, but something that is very necessary for me as a person to not have those sinus infections, which I no longer have. They stopped as soon as I had that done. And it was not pleasant, I might add.
I think all of this is it's more a matter of awareness than it is of ceremony and circumstances. you could have all kinds of ceremony and and things, and and you can still be. I don't think that particularly changes you. You can be baptized, sprinkled. I've been all of them. But it wasn't until I became aware of God everywhere and in everyone that I was baptized. It's a baptismal of awareness, of awakening. To inner baptism, and then but you're really not that until you realize that whether or not other people are aware of it, they are also. The ceremony doesn't play a whole lot of, to me, purpose in this, other than some people feel if they go through the ceremony, then they must be fine. And
What's the
we all
scripture
are.
that Paul talks about that these people received the Holy Spirit even though they hadn't been officially baptized?
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember. But all this to say, to put a cap on it, maybe I should entitle this lesson. I titled it something polite like Sign of the Covenant. Maybe we should title it When Christians Talk About Circumcision, Genesis chapter 7. Like a Christian but
it kind of leaves the women out, by the way.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Or at least we don't get there till the 8th day.
Yeah.
Well,
But all this to say, if you've ever sat through a church service that was laden with symbolism that was very meaningful to you, alongside maybe a guest that thought it was all very odd and very even off-putting and just sort of weird. I have had this experience where I brought somebody to a church, my church, when I was younger, and they found everything we were doing there very odd and very weird. And they even kind of, their impulse was to kind of make fun of some of the things. And I was very upset about this until I've gotten older and reflected on the event and come to realize that what was happening there, those rituals, meant something to me because of my own interaction and experience with them. Raised in the house I was raised, in the context I was raised, and somebody outside doesn't have those powerful connections. And I feel like when we're talking about, whether we're talking about circumcision or baptism or communion, or any form of ritual, it's like that. When you're on the outside and you haven't been raised in a community that held these things in this, saw the profundities that they obviously see, it just comes off as odd. And so I think the learning for me is to withhold judgment as long as possible until I understand it, and then you can have opinions about it. So I agree with feeling very uncomfortable. That's putting it mildly. I don't like that children are made to feel pain in their infancy in keeping with a ritual. I don't know what to do about that, but I also don't like that. I'm comforted that there are times where at the bris, as we were describing, doesn't seem to be any pain or discomfort. I could sign off on that. But also I always have to approach this as an outsider. I'm not a part of those communities and they don't hold that same meaning for me. And therein lies the humility. Mm-hmm. So I think that we've been in this for about an hour now.
Yeah.
So an hour's discussion on circumcision. I
was just looking down at chapter 9 and saw this part that jumped out at me. And then God said to Abraham, as you must keep my covenant.
Yeah.
You must.
Yeah. And they do. So on that note, it was wonderful to see all your faces. Thanks for joining, BK. We'll work on getting you in. It looks like you called in through a phone. So did you dial a number, like a phone number?
Yeah, I think that's what either that or I just touched the site.
Okay.
That was,
we'll work on getting you into where you can see everything. You missed some interesting
I'm hoping
graphics.
to get myself into a new phone.
Good.
Very shortly.
Very good. Well, you all take care, and I'll speak with you or see you hopefully at some point this week, or if not
Okay.
now, Sunday. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.